Jason, you forgot the most important part, that I served as rabbi here at Anshe Emet Synagogue.
I didn't like
the the most anxiety-producing aspect of preparing for this evening actually had nothing to do with the subject matter. Given the enormity of my debt of gratitude to this institution and my love for its professional and its lay leadership and the circle of community to which Debbie and I will be forever indebted, on multiple occasions since Rabbi Segal invited me, I've been flat out verklempt, just thinking about what it would be like to speak here after all of these years. I've often reflected that while JTS may have granted me my ordination, it was here at Anshe Emet that I learned how to be a rabbi. Debbie and I look back on our years here with such fondness, the birth of our 4 children, and the relationships that are forever sacred. And Rabbi Segal, not until I became a rabbi of my own shul did I realize what a great job it is to be an assistant rabbi. So I'm forever grateful for your mentorship, for your friendship, and for your collegiality. And please extend mine and Debbie's deepest condolences on Janet's loss. May your father-in-law's memory be for a blessing. Thank you so much for your kindness, as always, and it means the world to be here, and it's great to be back. So with great clarity, I can recall Rabbi Dr. Byron Sherwin relating to me the story of creation by way of the rabbis who tell of God's plan to create humanity in the divine image. Having heard of God's intent, the angelic retinue grew jealous and sought to foil God's plan by hiding God's image from humanity. One angel suggested that the image be put at the bottom of the sea, where no person will ever find it. Another angel countered that God's image should be placed at the top of the highest mountain peak, safe from a prying humankind. Hearing these ideas, the wisest of angels responded, "There may come a day that humans learn to plumb the depths of the deepest ocean. So too, humans may one day learn to climb the highest mountain. So let's hide God's image in the safest place of all. Let's hide it in the human soul itself, for that's the one place that they'll never think to look." It's a religious insight of the highest order to consider that the very thing for which we search throughout our lives, the divine spark of our humanity, is all the while embedded within. And if this is the case, if the nature of religious education then snaps into focus, the true task of spiritual development and mentorship is that which sits within us is nurtured and nudged forward by way of our tradition to find the best version of ourselves. One cannot seek to make someone a child, an employee, or a student someone they are not. Such a project will inevitably lead to failure and frustration on all sides. The task of spiritual mentorship is one of empowerment towards the goal of self-knowledge, to help an individual find the keys to his or her own soul, to find that image of God planted deep within, and let that person give expression to his or her distinctive voice in the chorus of humanity. For me, and for far too many to count, Rabbi Dr. Byron Sherwin, Harav Dov Levi ben Shalom HaKohen, was that mentor who unlocked the keys to the fullest expression of our potentiality. His mentorship, his scholarship, and his menschlichkeit, a steadying force in our respective quests to find our authentic selves. Neither his first, final, or finest student, I'm but one of many, brought close to Dr. Sherwin by way of my doctoral work on his dear friend, the late Rabbi Dr. Louis Jacobs. At a critical and uncertain moment in my own intellectual and professional journey, Dr. Sherwin and I would spend long afternoons discussing Louis Jacobs, Jewish theology, the rabbinate, and well beyond. His kindness in reading, critiquing, and sharpening my ideas is a debt too great to ever be repaid. I can recall clearly as he puffed away on his odd, what are they called, cigarillos, right? The greatest thrill and compliment I could receive was when he would take another one out, lighting one from the stub of another, as if to say our conversation could continue. He wasn't done with me just yet. If he didn't, if the smoke ended, then I knew it was time to pack up my books. If, as Byron, who was wont to cite Hermann Hesse, each person has only one vocation, to find the way to himself, then it's on behalf of all of his students, many of whom are in the room this evening, that I express profound gratitude to him for showing me my path. I want to publicly thank where's Judy? Judy Sherwin. It was here, at the prompting of Anshe Emet's own late Rabbi Seymour Cohen of blessed memory, that you were introduced to Byron. This room, the room the two of you were married in. I hope it provides you with great comfort to know that through Rabbi Segal's leadership, his memory is now being honored here by way of a lecture on Jewish thought and theology. I'm grateful for all your kindness and friendship. Once Debbie and I settled into New York, Byron reached out and asked me and Debbie to look out for his son, Jason. Jason, you've since become a Ben Bait in our home, a place at our Shabbat and Yontif table with or without notice. My children adore you, and Debbie would adore you just a little more if only you found a nice Jewish girl with whom to say. In choosing, Judy, I had to get it.
No, you didn't.
In choosing a title for tonight's lecture, the most important word that Rabbi Segal and I spoke of was the word preliminary. Given the depth and breadth of Rabbi Sherwin's work, our proximity to his passing, and the limited time we have together, it would be impossible and somewhat foolish to presume to be comprehensive. To do so would take far more time and far more scholars in all the diverse fields in which Dr. Sherwin distinguished himself than we have this evening. So on a preliminary basis, our task this evening is to try to understand some key dimensions of Dr. Sherwin's work as informed by his biography. As Heschel wrote, the wisdom of philosophers is not a commodity that can be produced on demand. We should not regard them as mirrors reflecting other people's problems, but rather as windows allowing us to view the author's soul. The soul only communes with itself when the heart is stirred. In the years ahead, I hope this lecture provides a platform for the Anshe Emet family to explore other philosophers and theologians and pathways of religious thought. Tonight, on its inaugural lecture, we examine the thought and life of the thinker to whom the series is dedicated, Rabbi Dr. Byron Sherwin. Byron was born to Zisi here. We're honored by your presence. And Sydney of blessed memory in the Bronx in 1946. An early name change in the family turned the Rosenthal's to the Sherwins. Byron grew up a product of multiple influences. A Yiddish-speaking grandmother on one side, and a fourth-generation American on the other side, both at home in his Eastern European roots and his American ones. For instance, in the introduction of one book, Byron writes, "Among my earliest memories are the taste of the homemade sponge cake my grandmother would feed me before I went to bed, the Yiddish and Polish lullabies she would sing to me as she tucked me in, and the stories she would tell me before I fell asleep. Often when fast asleep in my grandparents' small apartment in the Bronx, I would live these stories in my dreams. At home, my American-born and bred parents would read me stories of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, of Robin Hood, of George Washington and his cherry tree. But Grandma's stories were not read, they were told. Her stories flowed from childhood memories of what and whom she had seen in far-off lands, pre-World War I Poland." Byron's relationship with Abraham Joshua Heschel, to whom we'll return shortly, would provide him with a deep immersion with the language and lore of pre-war Europe. But it did not begin with Heschel. It was in Byron's DNA. On more than one occasion, Dr. Sherwin warned in the most graphic terms of the effects of losing the cultural, religious, and literary legacy of pre-war Europe. And to some degree, his scholarly career can be viewed as a sustained effort to retrieve, preserve, and revivify that pre-war heritage, or as a title of one of his best books on Polish Jewry is called, Sparks Amidst the Ashes. As his teacher Abraham Joshua Heschel wrote, and Byron often cited, quote, "When I think of what our people accumulated over the centuries that nobody will ever know about, it seems like a second Holocaust. Hitler destroyed our people, now we let their spirit die." Thus took shape the contours of Rabbi Sherwin's bifurcated soul, both at home in tradition, but also openly critical of that tradition. His mother, sympathetic, I'm told, to all things religious, and his late father playing the loyal opposition. The seeds laid for Byron's own eventual demeanor on matters Jewish, both devotional and curmudgeon-like, this worldly and otherworldly. Byron would take refuge in his books, an insatiable appetite that could never be quenched. My favorite story being when Byron played Little League at the behest of his father, also the coach, who wanted his oldest son to engage in athletics. Byron was a big kid and he had great hand-eye coordination, but was predictably to be found on the bench reading a book. His father grabbed him to pinch hit. He smacked the double, stood on second base, and he called timeout. His father ran over to him to find out what was going on, at which point Byron asked his father if he could now come out of the game to go back to reading his book. From the Bronx to Queens, Byron was introduced to Jewish communal life by way of the late great Rabbi Ben Zion Boxer and Cantor Zvi Aharoni. Byron always had a love for Chazanut, always speaking warmly of Chazan Mizrahi. At the urging of his grandmother, Byron would soon enter the joint Columbia JTS program, a perfect context for this young man in his zealous pursuit of both secular and Jewish studies. I remember, and so do you, the first time I ever used the word palimpsest here at Anshe Emet. I learned the word from Dr. Sherwin. He wrote, in the Middle Ages, due to the scarcity of paper, people would often write new texts on top of earlier ones. Such writing is called a palimpsest. In Sherwin's view, as his teacher Heschel before him reasoned, Jewish scholarship is most authentic when considered to be a palimpsest. Jewish thought or theology is never created ex nihilo. It's always built on that which preceded it. Or to use a favorite medieval analogy of Dr. Sherwin's, the contemporary theologian is like a dwarf riding on the shoulders of a giant. There are those, to be sure, who have a regressive view of Jewish thought, that the greats are all behind us and we're never going to rank up to them. We are the dwarfs and they are the giants. So too there are progressives who believe that it's only the one who's perched on top of the giant's shoulders who can see the full breadth of the human experience. Dr. Sherwin understood the importance of both. Without the giant, he wrote, there is no viable foundation. Without the dwarf, the giant might become a relic of bygone days. It was a point of pride for Dr. Sherwin that his work was built on the achievements of his teachers, those he knew and those who long preceded him. So who were Byron's teachers? What was the palimpsest upon which he wrote? Let me identify three. The first, a man he never knew but wrote of with great warmth, who was Solomon Schechter, the founder of the Jewish Theological Seminary and great scholar of rabbinic literature. In Byron's treatment of Schechter, one senses an admiring intimacy that may say as much about Byron as it does about Schechter. Schechter, the scholar saint, committed as he was to the project of American Jewry, and had an ever appreciation and reverence for the mystical elements of our tradition. Schechter, endowed with a formidable and supple intellect that could quote Chaucer alongside rabbinics, whose breadth of Jewish knowledge was such that one could say that nothing Jewish was alien to him. Schechter, who notwithstanding his prodigious scholarly and institutional achievements, was concerned most with what he called Galut HaNefesh, the exile of the Jewish soul. The shadow of Schechter looms large over Rabbi Sherwin. The second I'll call a friend and senior colleague, the person who brought me close to Byron, a man by the name of Rabbi Louis Jacobs. Now is not the time to speak at length of Louis Jacobs. I actually did for 8 years here at Anshe Emet. And I could. I wrote a book on him, but I won't. Like Schechter, like Sherwin, Jacobs was at home in the range of Jewish literature, on scholarship and secular studies. Like Schechter, Jacobs held an abiding appreciation for the mystical element of our tradition. Jacobs advocated flexibility within tradition, intellectual honesty rather than unreflective ancestor worship, and he shunned dogmatic certainty, often citing Byron's hero, the Maharal of Prague, who wrote that the quest for Torah is itself Torah. Perhaps most importantly, Jacobs had a gift for explaining the most complex ideas in an accessible manner. In certain scholarly circles, the word popular is a dirty word, as if to say that if your books are to be found on the shelves of Barnes & Noble, you're not to be taken seriously. Jacobs and Sherwin were both scholars, but they were also theological educators. They both wrote for the Ivory Tower and the Jew in the Pew, for Byron and Spertus, Roosevelt, LSTC, and countless adult and student groups. They understood their obligations both to the past and to the future, and if their books were popular, well, that was a badge of honor. That was the whole point. All this and much, much more Sherwin got from his friend Jacobs. The most significant intellectual and religious influence, however, would be the man who Byron met upon arriving at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and that would be Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. Their story began not in the classroom or Beit Midrash, but on a boat in Ramat Poconos, where Byron was staffing the waterfront and Heschel was visiting his daughter. Byron taught Heschel how to row, and Heschel taught Byron a whole lot more. As Heschel's student, as his assistant, Byron was drawn into his confidence, not just in scholarly pursuits, but in those tumultuous years of the late 60s on the most vexing social issues of the day. It would be by way of Heschel that Byron's own voice took shape. Important as scholarship may be, as a student of Heschel, theology could never be a mere intellectual parlor game. Scholarship was meant to be in service of the Jewish people, to make our ancestors our contemporaries, and to advance the cause of Yiddishkeit. This was a scholar-saint model of Heschel to which Byron would aspire. Byron's thesis on Judah Loew of Prague, Byron's arrival in Chicago for a 4-decade career at Spertus, these all happened by way of Heschel's promptings. But that was only the start of it. I encourage everyone to read Rabbi Sherwin's essay on Heschel, the first 3 pages never once mentioning Heschel, rather an analysis of the nature of a master-disciple relationship, a description that culminates in the brief but telling comment, quote, "Abraham Joshua Heschel is my master, my mentor." Heschel's commitment to the lost world of pre-war Europe, Heschel's commitment to the philosophy of Judaism, Heschel's attention to ethics, scholarship, and mysticism, most of all, and I'll expand on this soon, Heschel's abiding belief that the possibility for self-transcendence sits within every human being. Of all of Byron's influences, it's that of Heschel that looms largest. Schechter, Jacobs, and Heschel all shared a passion for Jewish theology, a lifetime vocation that would become Rabbi Sherwin's. In one of his most biting essays, drawing on the work of his colleague, the late Dr. Eugene Borowitz, Sherwin characterizes American Jews as reverse Marranos. There was a time in 14th and 15th century Spain when Jews had to convert to Catholicism in order to survive. These Jews, called Marranos, took on a Catholic exterior, but on the inside remained steadfastly, if a bit idiosyncratically, Jewish. Contemporary Jewry, no longer living in the insular ghettos of Eastern Europe, have emigrated, geographically, economically, and most importantly, sociologically, into the freedom and allure of a cosmopolitan society that embraces Jews as Jews. This has resulted in a new species of Jew, a reverse Marrano, an American Jew who is openly and proudly Jewish on the outside, but on the inside is estranged from his or her Judaism. It's our very freedoms that have placed us in a form of galut hanefesh, of spiritual exile. We've constructed a series of masks, or as Byron wrote, substitute faiths, compensatory gestures masking the self-knowledge that we are not who we say we are. On the most basic level, American Jews practice a sort of chopped liver or lox and bagels Judaism, whereby we think the thinnest manifestation of Jewish identity somehow serves as a substitute for substantive engagement with the riches of our faith and tradition. We're proud of our Jewishness and of Jews, pointing to Jerry Seinfeld and Mark Zuckerberg and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, counting off Jewish Nobel laureates, an Adam Sandlerification of Judaism that does not fortify the depth of our faith and is an altogether unreliable means to transmit it to the next generation. Alternatively, American Jews will engage in what philosophers call the reductionist fallacy, mistakenly identifying or reducing the whole of Judaism into one of its parts. We frame the argument for Jewish identity, Sherwin wrote, for instance, in the language of Holocaust remembrance, the obligation to be Jewish, lest we hand Hitler a posthumous victory. Or we throw our energies into fighting anti-Semitism, an altogether worthy cause but a far cry from a positive argument for Jewish identity. Or we reduce Judaism to ethics, or tikkun olam, or Israel advocacy, or UJA, or any number of acts of American civil religion that, though critically important to Jews and Jewish identity, should not be confused as a substitute for Judaism. These are substitutes, masks by which an alienated American Jewry compensates for not living a vibrant, engaged expression of our Jewish faith. Which is why I believe Sherwin always comes back to theology, asking what a contemporary Jew can believe. To be a Jew means to struggle with faith, to search for meaning, to be willing to ask ultimate questions. Who am I? What am I? What is it that God wants of me? What is my life's meaning, and how does the toolbox of Jewish law and literature help address these existential questions? On more occasions than I can recall, I've assigned Byron's essay on the theology of the Jewish holidays, an essay that points to how each of the holidays speaks to core questions of the human condition. In many ways, I think this was Dr. Sherwin's task, to translate the riches of Jewish thought into a language that would resonate with the Jew of today. In his words, quote, to construct from the resources of tradition an authentic and coherent formulation of Jewish religious belief. His essays on theodicy, on fear and love of God, on the human body and the divine image, on God as a young artist, creating, destroying, and recreating worlds, his essays too numerous to count on Jewish ethics as theological ethics. For Sherwin, Jewish theology was an incessantly gushing fountain. In what I think is Dr. Sherwin's best essay, he identifies 4 criteria to evaluate Jewish theology. First, authenticity, then coherence, then contemporaneity, and communal acceptance. So authenticity. The Jewish theologian must be an informed stakeholder in the tradition. Second, coherence. It must be clear and communicable. As Byron would love to say in the name of Louis Jacobs, holy nonsense is still nonsense. Contemporaneity. The theologian is not a historian of Jewish thought. His or her work must speak to the present day of the searching Jew. And finally, and perhaps most interestingly, communal acceptance. In other words, if a theological tree falls in the forest and nobody hears it, then for Sherwin, it has not made a sound and maybe has not even fallen. These are the 4 criteria of a valid Jewish theology, the criteria by which Sherwin assessed others and constructed his own. So what is the core of Rabbi Sherwin's thought and theology? What does he say differently or uniquely or better than everyone else? Sherwin believed that authentic human existence was to be found in viewing one's life as a work of art. The seed of the idea, I believe, comes from Heschel, who famously called on young people to, quote, remember that the meaning of life is to build a life as if you are a work of art. Or alternatively, in his 65 book, What is Man?, Heschel wrote, right living is like a work of art, the product of a vision and of a wrestling with concrete situations. Sherwin got the idea from Heschel and he took the ball and ran with it. Listen to a passage This one from a book Sherwin wrote with Anshe Emet's own late Rabbi Seymour Cohen of blessed memory. The Jewish people produced no edifices to rival Notre Dame, no paintings like those of Michelangelo or Raphael. The particular art form cultivated by the Jews was not architecture, painting, or sculpture, but human existence. The artistic masterpieces of the Jewish people do not hang in any museum. They appear in no tourist guidebook. The great works of art that emerge from Jewish history are the lives and teachings of the greatest people it has engendered. The first step in crafting one's life or soul is to study past masterpieces. One must then put in hard and constant work. As the 19th century Rabbi Israel Salanter wrote, "Moral development is like the flight of a bird. Once a bird stops exerting effort to fly and flap its wings, it falls. To build one's life as a work of art requires constant exertion, study, reflection, and practice. The purpose of life," explained Sherwin, "is to live a purposeful life. This act, nevertheless, is far more than just a self-help slogan. It's a profoundly theological act. Humanity is created in God's image. Just as God creates, so too human beings should be creative." Again, in Sherwin's words, "God's most superlative artwork is the human being. It is a human task to complete God's unfinished artistic masterpiece, the human person. Ethics is a way in which one creates life as a work of art. Each of us is an unfinished masterpiece of God." Work, wisdom, imagination, focus, self-reflection, humility. Sherwin was deeply influenced by the Jewish school of Musar, or ethical discipline. These are the efforts that go into creating life as a work of art. Preparing for tonight was like doing a jigsaw puzzle, taking all the diverse pieces of Byron's writing and trying to put them into a coherent picture. What is the thread that ties it all together? What explains his explorations of Jewish ethics, Kabbalah, American Jewry, Polish Jewry, and an odd fascination with the legendary Golem of Prague, the clay-like Frankenstein-esque being brought to being by the Maharal of Prague to save our people? My aha moment arrived when I was reading Byron's most peculiar, most fun, and most relevant book for this audience, The Cubs and the Kabbalist, a novel on how a resourceful rabbi exorcised a curse from the friendly confines and created a golem whose slugging abilities tried to lift the Cubbies' fortunes. It's a great read, synthetic, scholarly, and personal, combining Byron's work on the Golem of Prague, Jewish mysticism, and Judy, your beloved Cubs. But I dog-eared one passage in particular from the book, a dialogue shared between two rabbis as they spoke of the Kotzker Rebbe that I'd like to share. Once a skeptic came to the Rabbi of Kotsk and said to him, "I hear that you can perform miracles, that you can create a golem." The Rabbi of Kotsk replied, "There's an even greater miracle than creating a golem." "What's that?" the skeptic asked. "It's when a person becomes a mensch, a true human being, a morally and spiritually developed individual, a person who has become all that he can be, a person who has crafted his soul into a work of art. When a person has worked hard to acquire wisdom, love, empathy, compassion, and understanding, and has succeeded, that's the true miracle." For me, this passage is a thread that ties it all together. Each one of us has a choice of whether to be a soulless golem or a mensch. The choice is ours. The fact that we are limited as human beings is not only not an impediment to us arriving at our full potential, but it's actually the very point. Like an artist staring at a boundaried canvas, Sherwin wrote, being aware of one's real limitations is a source of power rather than weakness, not a confession of failure, but an act of inner liberation. And as for the greatest limitation of all, our mortality, Sherwin would write, confrontation with the reality of our own mortality is not meant to stimulate morbidity, but rather to stimulate us to fashion our lives around that which we want to speak for us and of us when we are no longer here. We must remember, as William James counseled, that the greatest use of life is suspended for something that will outlast it, to craft a life that death does not entail oblivion. The shadow of our lives can extend well beyond our length of years. Again, in Sherwin's word, a person practices generativity through creative endeavors, through helping another, mentoring another. It is not surprising that when asked how they achieved what they accomplished, most people whom we would want to emulate often say, well, there was this teacher. Byron Sherwin was that teacher for so many. He took genuine pleasure in helping others find their own voices. So many reflecting, as can I, as many in this room can. Nobody ever did for me what Byron did for me. Byron's theological vision is compelling because it passes the very criteria of authenticity, coherence, contemporaneity, and communal acceptance that he set out for anyone. His vision is compelling because in this age of the sovereign self, Sherwin found a language that's both anchored in the riches of tradition, but also in sync, increasingly so, with the spirit of our age. Is it perfect? Certainly not. Can we be critical? We certainly can. Sherwin himself was fond of telling the story of when the Finnish composer Sibelius visited Germany. He was shown statues and monuments of great German composers like Mozart and Beethoven. He turned to his guide and said, "You know, it's interesting. Composers tend to worry all the time about what the critics will say about their work, yet have never seen a statue or monument dedicated to a single critic. I think I'll concentrate on composing the best music I can and not worry so much about what the critics will say, and my music will be better for it." Sherwin was not just a student of Jewish theology, he was a creator, a constructive theologian in his own right. He composed the best theology he could. He didn't worry about the critics. He took a stand in the arena, took his place in the pantheon of Jewish theologians, striving valiantly, and is thus deserving of our credit and our admiration. I chose the title of tonight's lecture from one of Byron's final books, The Life Worth Living. The book, an extended meditation on that very topic, ends with the famous tale of Rabbi Yitzchak from Krakow, and it's that story with which I shall conclude. One night, Rabbi Yitzchak dreamt of a far-off land called Bohemia, in the city of Prague, in which stood a great castle with a bridge, and under the bridge a treasure was buried. Rabbi Yitzchak awoke, trying to shrug off the dream, but the next night and the night following, the dream returned. Leaving a note for his wife and children, he set off for 3 days and nights on a cold and dangerous journey. Rabbi Yitzchak arrived in Prague. He saw the castle, he saw the bridge, but despite his travels, despite the risk, despite his best efforts, there was no treasure to be found. Crouching down in despair, he sat and wept, grieving his misfortune. A passing Polish guard strolled by him, asking what was amiss. Rabbi Yitzchak explained the dream and thus his despair, at which point the guard laughed aloud, saying, "Foolish Jew, who's ever heard of such a thing, listening to crazy dreams? Once, in fact, I dreamt of a city called Krakow, in which lived a poor man called Yitzchak, and in a one-room house, and in the middle of the room there was a stove, and under the stove a great treasure buried. But who should listen to such nonsense?" said the guard as he walked away. Rabbi Yitzchak immediately got up, he returned home, he dug beneath the stove, and there he found a great treasure. With half the money he built a great synagogue, where it still stands today in Krakow. It is called Rabbi Yitzchak's Synagogue. Why did Rabbi Sherwin conclude with that story? Was it because it was about Prague, or maybe the presence of a miracle? Or maybe the tale is a bit autobiographical. After all, if we replace Krakow with Chicago, could the story not be about Byron himself? Perhaps. But I think the message of the story is one and the same as the Midrash of the angels with which I began, that Byron taught me years ago. Namely, that the treasure we seek, unbeknownst to us, is actually right beneath our feet. Our greatest spiritual journeys, our lech lechas, are not about going outward, but going inward. We seek to be that which we are not, forgetting that the greatest tragedy of all would be to live a plagiarized existence. Our relationships with God, our relationships with each other, our relationships with ourselves The first step of spiritual development is planted within. The sparks of the divine right there, right here, waiting to be realized. Yes, read Sherwin's books. That would honor him. So too study the Torah to which he devoted his life. That too would pay him tribute. But the greatest honor, the one he would want from each of us, the question he would want us to ask as we left here this evening, is whether each and every one of us has endeavored to make our lives a work of art. And if we haven't, then what are the steps we need to take to make it so? Byron was fond of citing the French writer Valéry, who once wrote, "We are fated to live in the times into which we have been born." In considering Rabbi Dr. Byron Sherwin's achievements, one inevitably must ask what is forever lost with his passing and what legacy remains for generations to come. The depth and range of Byron's knowledge reflects a set of circumstances that would be difficult, if not impossible, to replicate. The tensions that came to be crystallized in him, though still resonating, are, on some level, representative of a bygone era. Nevertheless, the forthright, clear, honest, and synthetic manner in which he conducted his quest, connected with the past, at home in tradition, in sympathy with humanity, remains a model that transcends the limitations of his life and the world that produced him. By dint of his engagement with tradition, fierce intellectual integrity, and constant encouragement regarding the individual quests of the Jews in his midst, Sherwin's work is instructive, if not required reading, for those wishing to participate in future discussions in constructive Jewish theology. His life was a life worth living. His life was a work of art. Tehei nishmatot Rabbi Tzura Chaim. May the memory of my teacher, Rabbi Dr. Byron Sherwin, Harav Dov Levi ben Shalom HaKohen, be bound up in the bond of eternal life. Thank you.